Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the online book club of the Association of Jewish Refugees. My name is Deborah Barnes. For anyone not familiar with AJR, we are the national charity supporting Britain's Jewish refugees and survivors of Nazi oppression, and we're committed to the education of others about the Holocaust. For more information about what we do, please go to our website, and you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook. As is usual with our online events, we're going to keep everyone on mute, but there will be an opportunity to ask questions later on. Please write your questions in the chat function or raise your hand and we'll come to you later. We'll do our best to include everyone. We are recording the session and it will be made available on our YouTube channel. If you don't want to appear on the recording, simply turn off your camera. Our guest speaker today is Ariana Neumann. Ariana was born and raised in Venezuela. She was previously involved in publishing and worked as a foreign correspondent for Venezuela's The Daily Journal. She now lives in London with her family. This is Ariana's book. I've got a copy here, beautiful copy, When Time Stopped. And this is Ariana's first book. I absolutely loved it. And I wasn't the only one. It's a New York Times bestseller and Financial Times Book of the Week, among many other accolades. Welcome, Ariana. Thank you for joining us today. Would you like to start by telling us about yourself and about your book, and perhaps to give us a short reading?
I would love to do that. Thank you very much for having me here. Thank you, everybody, for joining. It's, I think the best part of this whole process, the research, has been meeting people and connecting to people. So thank you. I have to start by telling you, I think, I'm not going to tell you anything about me, because I think if, as I speak, you'll garner enough about me, I hope. So I'm going to talk to you about my book. And the first thing you should know about it is that it wasn't meant to be a book. It didn't start its life as a book. It started its life as a mystery. I wanted to solve the mystery of my father, and I wanted to search for my roots. I wanted to know where I came from. And as I pieced together all the pieces of this mystery, I discovered these tales which I thought were marvelous, and tales that had to do with my family and who I had never, not only not met, but never heard about, tales that had to do with their friends and with my friends. And I realized that if I didn't tell the story, no one else was going to. So you have to come back with me a little bit to when I was a little girl. I grew up in Venezuela, in a Venezuela of the 70s and 80s, which is absolutely nothing like the Venezuela of today. It was a place of potential. It was a place of development. It was a place of opportunity. It was vibrant and exciting and colorful. And I had an absolutely blissful existence there. I was the daughter of a very successful Renaissance man. He was an industrialist mostly, but he dabbled in all sorts of things, everything from art to education to newspapers. And I wanted for absolutely nothing as a little girl, except perhaps that key to unlock his mystery. You see, all I knew as I was growing up is that he had emigrated with his brother, that he had come to Venezuela in 1949, and that he had come from Prague. And I knew absolutely nothing else. I always thought, and I'm not sure whether this was told to me or whether I just assumed it as I was growing up, that because he had arrived in 1949, he had been escaping communism. And as I sifted through my memories, I realized as well that the phrase escaping a broken Europe seemed to come up. So anyways, back to when I was a little girl in this beautiful house in this beautiful country. It's 1979 or 1980, and I really, more than anything in the world, I want to be a detective. So I started, inspired by Enid Blyton. I wanted to be a bit like a sort of Miss Marple / Lois Lane. And I started this detective club with my cousins and my friends, and we would spy on people. And one of those days, my cousin spied on my father. He seemed to be moving a box from this secret long room where he repaired watches, where he only had the key, to this bookshelf. And I waited for everyone to go. I went and I found this box. And I was really disappointed because I expected it to be filled with treasure. And when I picked it up, it was light, and it was obviously, there was no treasure in it, obviously. But, I opened it because you have to scour every single place if you're going to be a proper detective. And I found some papers, amongst which was a photograph of my father. And it was an ID card. I could tell it was in French and in German, which I didn't speak, but I spoke French. And it said Berlin, 1943. And in the place where it had the name, it had someone else's name. So it wasn't my father's name. And I was terrified, absolutely terrified. And sorry, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. Somebody unmuted. It's fine. We can hear you very clearly.
Sorry. So anyways, so this box terrified me. I never got to the bottom of it. And it wasn't until 2001, when my father died, that he left me the same box. And this time the box didn't just have a few papers. It was absolutely crammed with documents and with a retrospective diary that he had written about his time in Berlin. So the book really is two things. It's my father's story during the war, the story of his survival against all odds as a Czech Jew. But the book really runs on two levels. On the one hand, you have these edgy moments, which perhaps belong more of a thriller, because my father's story of survival is quite unusual and astounding. But it's also the story of how I discovered this huge, vibrant, beautiful family I hadn't known. I not only hadn't known, but I didn't even know existed. So as much as there's a thriller bit to it, I'd like to think that the book says something about telling stories in general. My family stories, of course, and their friends' stories, but they were just normal people in unusual circumstances. So I'd like to think it says something about telling everyone's story, about whether these stories are mine or yours, that your families, every family has these stories. So I'm going to read a little bit from the book. And before I do, you have to imagine this, just so that I can place you a little bit in where we are. So you're 22 years old. You are from Prague. It is 1943, and you are Jewish. It is May. All of your family are in concentration camps, aside from your brother and a few cousins that had been saved by being in intermarriages. You don't know where they are, except for where your parents are. You are aware that your parents, you know that your parents are in Theresienstadt, and not only do you know this, but you have letters from them saying that you have to do whatever you can to avoid being transported. So your transport ticket arrived in March 2 months ago, and you've been hiding for 2 months in a tiny little makeshift room in the family's paint factory in Prague. And if you stay there, they're going to find you. The Gestapo are looking for you. You absconded from a transport. You're on their wanted list. So you cannot stay there. So you have to do whatever you can. You have to do the unthinkable to fool your persecutors. You're going to go and do the craziest thing you could come up with. You're going to go to the center of it all. You're going to go to the belly of the beast, the one place where they will not look for you. And that's exactly what my father does. So I'm going to do a reading now, and it takes it's about 6 minutes, so please bear with me. I now know that my father took the night train to Berlin on the 3rd of May, 1943, the elite 147 train that departed Herbinske station in Prague at 1:44 a.m. and arrived in Berlin nearly 8 hours later at 9:23. In the spring of 2018, I traveled alone along the same route. It takes 4.5 hours today, and there is no longer a night train. Even if there had been, I would not have been brave enough to take it. I bought a ticket for the noon train on a May morning. The tracks trace the same path out of Prague as they did in 1943. To my surprise, as the train finally left the suburbs behind and curled along the wooded banks of the Vltava River to my right, I passed through the town of Lipčice. From the large carriage windows, I could clearly see the roof, balcony, and casements of my grandparents' country house. The train then headed north, weaving along the course of the river, and came within a kilometer of Terezin itself, before crossing the former Czech border and pushing on to Dresden. Then, finally, it reached Berlin. I followed my father's route 75 years after his journey, almost to the day, clutching copies of the papers that he had left me. As I made that pilgrimage, I hoped that the night on which my father traveled was moonless, and that in his fear, he did not notice his parents' house unlit as the train rolled onwards, that he did not know how very close he was to them in the blackness just south of Terezin. I hoped that he felt me cradling him, holding his hand across the worlds of time and experience that then and now lay between us. This is what my father wrote about that journey. The train did not illuminate the tracks. The carriages were dark. The dim light of the aisles only allowed you to see the coming shadows, the delineations of figures moving, the shells of bodies slumped. I could hear the sound of the train incessantly rumbling and churning. There were 5 others in my compartment, their faces hidden, like mine. The darkness is why I chose this train, this hour. It must have been close to dawn, 4 hours since we left Prague. The others might have slept, but I couldn't. I was too afraid. We were close to the German border now. I checked my documents again, the ticket, identity card, and the passport. I touched the passport on my left pocket, the one with the permit, to cross the border that Stenka had sourced. In my other, I had the identity card that Mila gave me. We had used a chemical to carefully erase the names and mix the inks to match the color of the rest of the text. It now read, Jan Sebesta, chemist, born in Alt-Bunzlau on 11th of March, 1921. Only the passport had the name Zdeněk Tuma. I sat in a first-class carriage. In front of me, a sign read, official personnel only. There was nothing official about me, but people see what they expect. And seated here, I hoped they would think me trustworthy. I tried to look important, unfazed, as I boarded the train. I prayed the identity check would be quick in this compartment, a swift formality. I owed Mila the passport also. She was the one who finally convinced Zdeněk. Things were awful enough. No one wanted to take unnecessary risks, so to have this passport was a miracle. On arrival, I was to post the passport back to Prague so that Zdeněk could use it to travel back to Berlin in 3 days. Helping me meant that they were both risking their lives. Zdeněk had not wanted to let me down, but he was terrified for his sake and for mine. He was scared that I couldn't pull it off. My main worry was the photo in Zdeněk's passport. Zdeněk's face was much thinner and much more angular than mine. His eyes, like clever piercing darts, were unlike my large green ones. You have the dreamy eyes of an artist, my mother had always said. The train stopped. I heard voices that I assumed to be the conductor and the border police. I took the thin glass vial covered in brown rubber from my pocket and placed it at the back of my mouth. I held it between the lower back left molars and the side of my cheek. I was told it would take only a few seconds, a minute at most. Cyanide poisons your nerves, so the brain dies first, then the heart. Would death be easy, or would I feel unspeakable pain? Passports, a German voice said. They were not asking for other papers, just passports. not the papers with the other name. I took a breath. In the darkened carriage, the handheld beam lit up each passport held by every extended hand. 3 men had the light flash in their faces, 2 remain obscured under their hanging coats. I pretended to be asleep. The guard shook me. I kept my face hidden beneath the coat, my eyes half closed. My hand moved the lapel a few centimeters to show deference and offered him the passport. He looked at it for a few seconds. I was certain that he must be able to see my heart pounding in my chest. Dankeschön, mein Herr, he muttered as he closed it and handed it back. I waited a few minutes to make sure they were gone. The train heaved forward and I was able to breathe again. I coughed and spat the ampoule into my hand. I placed it carefully back into my pocket. I would need it again. I slept until we pulled into the station in Berlin. It was mid-morning. I placed the passport in an envelope which I addressed to Stenka at the Central Post Office in Prague and sent it through the Reich Post. If I was caught now, there would be no more danger to Stenka. The warming sunlight shone in between the buildings as I stepped outside. Suddenly, my briefcase felt very light. It was a beautiful spring day in Berlin, May 1943, the 4th year of the Second World War. Berlin. There I was, now Jan Sebesta, a Czech chemist looking for a job and a room to rent.
Thank you. It's always really nice to hear the author read their own words, or rather the words of your father as well.
Well, yes, absolutely.
I mean, your father went to Berlin to be safe, but then he was almost escaping to Berlin. But then he ended up putting his own life in danger by spying for the Allies. Do you think that was his first intention?
No, I wish it was. I wish I could say that. I think, you know, he was selfless and wanted to just help. I think he was trying to survive, and he did the only thing he could think of, which was to join his best friend who was working at this factory of Warnecke and Bohm in Berlin. And someone asked me the other day whether he looked Jewish. And I'm not sure I know what that means. But I suppose he didn't. Certainly not enough that anyone suspected that he was anything other than Jan Sebesta, a Gentile who had decided to escape the forced labor, working in the fields, and decided to go and work in Berlin instead.
Yeah.
So I think once he was there, and he was volunteered to be a firefighter, and that was a pretty risky too. I think he figured he had nothing to lose, and I think I think for a variety of reasons, obviously he wanted the war to end, and this Dutch student found him.
Yeah.
And it just rolled on from there, and asked him to pass on information, and he was very diligent, which was incredible because he wasn't very diligent at all when he was studying in Prague. But once he was in Berlin, he figured the only way to survive would be to be very diligent and work very hard. So he started being party to secrets, and he was lucky enough to be able to pass information on.
Yeah. So the piece that you read was of your father's train journey, and you said that you did it yourself as well. Who did you do it with? Because that must have been quite difficult. Who did you take on that journey with you to do your research?
You know, I did it on my own. I didn't take anyone. And at times it felt like a mistake, I have to tell you, because when I went to Terezin, I knew that I couldn't do it on my own. And I dragged my poor children, who really, their half-term break, I'm sure they would have much rather been, somewhere sunny in Italy instead of wandering around Europe visiting concentration camps with their mother. But they were incredibly kind and generous and just held my hand throughout. And we had these wonderful moments where we went to the paint factory where my father was hiding, and we met the daughter of this man that helped my father hide. And it was really absolutely beautiful, because we were there, and the paint factory still stands today. It is now a discotheque. So that takes a little bit of the sort of, you know, drama out of it. But this wonderful, there was a wonderful moment where I realized that I wouldn't have been there, my children wouldn't have been there if it hadn't been for this woman's father. And we just burst into tears. The whole, I think there were about 13 of us, because by then my mother had said she was coming along, and my aunt, and, you know, it was a sort of family thing, really.
Yeah.
But Berlin, I thought I had to do it on my own. I think I felt that it would bring me closer to my father, and I thought I would possibly understand him better. And I am happy I did it on my own, I think, because I didn't think of anything else other than him for 4.5 hours in that train journey, which was very difficult, because then when I got to Berlin, and I know Berlin is a marvelous city, I have lots of friends there, but I had never been. And my every instinct was just to get out of there. I really felt sick to my stomach, and I cannot, you know, anyways, it was pretty, I mean, if it was harrowing for me 4.5 hours, sorry, for well, 75 years later, and just in 4.5 hours, I cannot imagine what it was like for my father in the middle of the war, to spend 10 hours, you know, fearing for his life.
Yeah. So you talked about your relationship, you just mentioned your relationship with your father, and I know that last week you attended AJR's event on second generation trauma, and that was something quite new to you. It was your first time maybe thinking about that. So tell us, you know, how was your father? How was your relationship? And obviously he'd already died by the time you did the investigation, but did it change your opinion of him?
Yes. So my father was marvelous on the one hand, because he was so interesting, and he was a fountain of knowledge, and he was so excited about the present and about the future. And, you know, I mean, he knew more about computers in, you know, 1999, 2000, 2001 that I think that I know now, actually. And he was just always excited by ideas. So it was really interesting to grow up with him, and he loved solving puzzles, and, you know, he liked mind games, and that's how we bonded. And I mean, obviously he's the only father I've ever had, so I don't know how my relationship would have been with anyone else. But as I observed my husband with our children, for example, I realized that they have a exchange of you know, of emotions, and they share secrets, like you would a friend. And that's not the kind of relationship I had with my father, not because he wasn't my friend, but just because he didn't know how to share emotions, I think. And I suppose that's part of the trauma. So going through all this has made me realize, well, it has made me understand why he was the way he was. And I guess, in a sense, not that he ever did anything that I should forgive him for, but I suppose there were times, and if I didn't know this, it would have been times where I would have found there was a lacking, or there was, you know, there was some frustration about, there was an enormous frustration about the fact that he wouldn't share any of his past with me, or of his family, because, you know, there were obviously his family to share with me, rather than, they were also a little bit my family. So I felt a bit cheated. And I felt I still feel very cheated that none of the Jewish heritage was passed on to me. And it was interesting going to a second gen thing, because I never really thought I was traumatized by my father. And I don't think I was. I had a blissful childhood, but there are definitely some little threads that you see, I think, in all the second generation. And I thought they were peculiar to me. I thought I was just a little neurotic at times, and just a bit anxious about certain things. And I realize now that they weren't. And one of the things, for example, that came out of this pandemic is the fact that we cannot leave. And that's been horrendous to me, because I I don't know why and where this comes from, and perhaps it comes from my father, but I've always needed to know how I escape a room, how I escape a country, how I escape anything. And actually, when I became British, I had to surrender all my passports for what I thought was going to be 3 days. And they wrote me a letter and say it was going to be a couple of weeks. And I actually was absolutely beside myself that I didn't have a passport. And I confided in my husband. I said, you know, I'm just really anxious. I don't have a passport. And he said, I said, you know, what if something happens and I have to go? And he said, what are you talking about? And, you know, he doesn't come from the same place I do. And he just had no comprehension, but I'm sure a lot of other second gens must be familiar with all these. And that was very obvious when I went to this meeting, which was a wonderful discovery, really. And I hope to attend a lot more. I found it very moving and very rewarding.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
So when did you decide to turn all your findings into a book? You said at the beginning it wasn't supposed to be a book. So how did that come about?
Well, so my father died in 2001. I started asking questions and probing things, and then the letters from my grandparents arrived in 2011, and I had those translated. And I then started tracing people and finding cousins all over the world. And the first ones I found actually were in San Diego, and they had in the US, in the West Coast, and they had no idea that they came from a Jewish family. They knew they had come from Prague, but that was it. They had no idea that the war had really decimated most of the family. And I promised them that I would put a book together, because I was speaking to cousins in the Czech Republic and cousins in France and friends of the family that have moved to Indonesia and Australia and all over the world. And I promised that I would put all the stories of all the family members in a book with a family tree. So I think that was about 2016 when I promised them that. And that book actually hasn't been written yet, because I do have all the material for it. But that probably is a 2,000-page book. And I'm not sure my readers would have been that thrilled if I had told every single person's story. I think lots of people have already said it's too detailed. So I think they would have had a big shock. Probably would have had 3 readers, and they were all family members. So it wasn't until 2018, really, that I was telling someone the story. And for 8 years, I think my husband has been saying this is incredible. It has to be a movie. It has to be a book. And, you know, your husbands always say things like that. But I think to try to encourage you. And anyway, so I never paid much attention. And then I went to, it was completely happened by magic, because I have a lot of friends who are what I call real writers, who have been writing for 30 years. And it's difficult to find an agent. It's difficult to find a publisher, as I'm sure you know, Deborah, from your own experience. I found one as if my magic, really, because I was telling a 90-year-old friend of my father's, the story of my father in New York, and he said, "Oh, I have to put you in touch with my neighbor," and his neighbor put me in touch with this incredible agent who is way too good to be my agent, but she's incredibly kind and wonderful, and I adore her. And she's called Claire Alexander, and Claire sort of guided me and made me write a different book than the one I would have written, and sold it to Scribner. So it started to become that book in 2018.
Okay, and it came out in the States first, yeah? So here.
It came out in the States, but just 3 weeks before. So the 4th of February, it came out in the States.
Okay, great. And you've had some lovely reviews. So that's
I've had some love. It's just been absolutely magical, because, you know, I always wanted to be a detective, but I actually really also always wanted to be a writer. And I wrote little things in newspapers which weren't very worthy of anything, really, in the features section, and I did some travel writing, but I've always written short stories, and I've always written as a form of therapy, really, and as a way of understanding things, and to have something to look back on that will jolt my memories. So to have it be a book is really a dream come true, and to have it, you know, and it started out life as a little book again. And it's still a little book, and it's very close to my heart, but it's I'm just incredibly lucky that it made the New York Times, you know, I'm still pinching myself. It made the New York Times bestsellers list. And I think it's, you know, despite the pandemic, people are still reading it. So it's magical, really.
Good. So years before you started doing your investigation, tell us about how you found out you were Jewish, because I did tell you previously I thought that was quite brutal.
Yes, I wouldn't say it was brutal. I went to a university in Boston. I went to a place called Tufts University, and they have an international orientation where the international kids, I think there were about 400 or 300 of us, all joined a few days early, and they took us around and they told us how to open an American bank account and, you know, whatever else. And in one of those conferences, we came out of this huge room at a place called the Fletcher School. This Mexican student, and he was quite remarkable because he was wearing a suit, and no one wears a suit in American colleges. He came up to me, incredibly sort of dashing and well dressed, and said, I was told we should meet. And I said, right, and why is that? And he said, well, because we're both Latin American, we're both good looking, and we're both Jewish. And I was completely taken aback by this. And I looked at him and I went, listen, I've got news for you. Yes, we're Latin American, obviously. I can tell by your accent, but you're not good looking and I'm not Jewish. And it was the start of a lifelong friendship. He is a dear friend of mine. He still lives in Mexico. And we still have huge debates about all sorts of things, about whether I am Jewish or not, because he's very Orthodox. So whenever he gets angry at me, he says, yeah, you know, you're just another neurotic Jew. And anyways, you're not even Jewish because your mom is not Jewish. But I was really shocked. Obviously, I was 17. It was September 1988. And I had never heard the word Jewish uttered before, certainly not in relation to me. So I called my father and I told him about this encounter, and he was amused at first. And he said, oh, so tell me about this boy. Who is he? And I said, well, his name is Elliot. And he said, we must have Jewish blood. And when I used those two words, Jewish blood, there was a complete silence on the other end of the phone. And I could just tell my father's entire demeanor changed. And he just said to me, you must never, ever use that expression, because that is what Hitler said about us. And it was at that moment that I think I just froze and I realized I had said obviously the wrong thing. And as I was just trying to think of what to say, he just put the phone down. And that was it. That was our discussion of, you know, my Jewish heritage. So that's how I found out I was Jewish. So it's pretty late on in someone's life to be told by a complete stranger that, you know, you are indeed Jewish. And I think Elliot said it was the name that, well, the name, and he always said you look Jewish. So there we go. My father didn't look Jewish enough, but apparently I do. So.
Well, I'm not going to comment on whether you look Jewish or not, but how do you feel? Do you feel, you know, since you found out, now you're living in London, do you feel any connection with the community?
Absolutely. I mean, how could you not? I mean, on the one hand, you know, 25 members of my family were murdered for being Jewish. So how could I not be Jewish? And actually, I often debated this question when I was doing the research, and I think you go one of two ways, really. You either embrace your roots as a defiance to the Nazis, or you do what my father did, and he was so traumatized, and I don't think he had processed it enough, that he just said, I am not going to label myself or my child with that yellow star that effectively killed all of my family. So I feel Jewish. I'm not a particularly religious person. I certainly like the traditions of Judaism, and I feel they make sense, certainly much more than any Christian tradition that I grew up with. So I love the way, I mean, one can say that, but I think the way Jews mourn is very beautiful and very effective. And I love the way they celebrate, and I love how, you know, it's life. It's Alheim. I can't say it, but it's, you know, the good and the bad. And I love the fact that God is not all good, because I can't conceive of a God that is all good. I can't conceive of a Christian God that is in this world that is all good, because it's how can it be? How can there be misery? But I can conceive of a God who is not always all about being good. So it resonates much more. And I, if I was a little more religious, and perhaps maybe when my children have gone and pester me a little less, I will start studying and convert. I don't know. But I certainly feel very privileged to be part of such a wonderful, strong, and fabulous community. And I notice racism and anti-Semitism much more than I ever did. How insidious it is.
Yeah.
Everyday life.
So your grandparents were in Terry's Inn for quite a long time, weren't they? And
Years, yeah.
sorry?
About 2 years.
2 years, yeah.
Years and a bit.
Very detailed accounts in the book because obviously they were sending letters back and forth and everything. You know, that's really fascinating. You said you went yourself already, so
Yes.
you know, but you had a big group with you.
I had a big group, and it's a very lonely place. I don't know if you have been to Theresienstadt?
No.
It's a strange place because it wasn't a purpose-built camp. So I'm not quite sure what I was expecting, but I suppose I was expecting, you know, the images that you see of camps with a sort of barbed wire, and I certainly wasn't expecting a beautiful 18th century town. So that struck me, that such horrendous evil could happen in such a beautiful setting, really. And I mean, it's just remarkable that my grandparents, who were quite old, managed to survive as long as they did for 2 years. And it was thanks to this very brave woman who wasn't Jewish, who snuck in the camps and who set up a system of contraband so that someone would, at great risk to them, take a parcel of things into the camp and bring their letters out. So I have a whole pack of letters.
Oh, you have the actual letters?
Well, actually, that is not an absolutely accurate statement. The actual letters are in my cousin's safe box. I have the PDFs, and I worked with those to translate them, because I wish I could show you an image, but I don't have one in hand. But you know, you just imagine a sort of piece of paper, and every little ounce of it is covered in tiny handwriting, and every little bit is used, of course, because paper was not something that you had a lot of in Theresienstadt.
Yeah. And obviously they were also helped a lot while they were there by one of the characters in the book, or one of the, you know, family members who for me was one of the most important characters in the book.
Stenka.
The Stenka.
Oh, yes. You know, someone said the other day that the book to me is, the book to them was about the courage of women, and I had never seen it that way.
Absolutely, I agree. I was going to put that down as a question. Yeah, I agree.
And you know, to me, it's true. The things that women do in these circumstances to protect not only themselves but their families and their loved ones is absolutely remarkable. And you know, my grandmother did some incredible things, but she, you know, my family had no choice. My father's choice to go to Berlin is pretty incredible, but they were being persecuted. So, you know, they were just trying to survive. But Stenka is really quite a remarkable character. So for those that haven't read the book, Stenka is in her 20s. She's studying law. She drives her own car. She is beautiful inside and outside. And she has, you know, the world at her feet. She has certainly, she has money. Because her grandfather had built all these buildings in Prague, so she's financially independent, and she uses those resources to help the family, who by 1939, when 1940, have no resources left, have no ability to work, and she just uses that to help them. And they were, of course, confined to wherever they were, and she took parcels around, took food around, took medicine to the various members, and then eventually actually snuck into the concentration of Terezin, into the camp of Terezin, not once, but twice. Once, the first time, just to make sure that my grandmother was alive. And I have a beautiful record of that. Actually, I have Stenka's writing about it, which she wrote in, I think, the late 90s, but remembering how she saw my grandmother. And I also have my grandmother's letter, which was sent out a few days after she saw Stenka. And she said that she had arrived in Terezin, and she had arrived there by miracle because she was meant to go to a camp. She was on a train that eventually went straight to Sobibor, but she fainted in the train. And it's because she fainted that she was taken out when they stopped at Terezin. And that ironically saved her life for another 2 years. So it enabled that, her fainting enabled me to get to know her through these beautiful letters. So she talks in the letters about meeting Stenka. And the second time she sneaks in to take my grandfather, because my grandfather, like most men in my family, had white hair by the time he was 30, and he was in his 50s. He needed to appear younger than his years, and you couldn't find hair dye towards the end of the war, and this is 1944, but shoe polish was, would do the trick. So Stenka sneaks into the camp because the couriers couldn't go in. She decides to go in herself and take the shoe polish. And my grandfather actually loves her and is so grateful that he makes this ring that I wear when I need to feel sort of grounded and connected, and I need a little bit of luck. And I don't know if you can see it there. And it's just, can you see it? It's a piece of sort of, it's not the most beautiful thing in the world, but it's a piece of copper pipe. But it means, I mean, to me, once I discovered the story behind it, I just thought it's the most beautiful thing in the world. So he saw a piece of copper pipe and crafted it and carved her initials and sent it out with one of the letters so she would have it. And anyways, and it's remarkable. That is actually the only thing I have of my grandfather's, really, aside from his words.
Very special.
So.
Right, I wonder if we can open, if we've got any questions.
I've had a few questions through on chat. Okay. So I'll ask these questions first, Ariana, and then we'll maybe get people to wave if they want to ask you the question directly. So the first question, forgive me because I've only got the name that comes up that's on your screen. So it's V. Hassan Lambert, who asked, hello, I can see you waving, who said, could you tell us more about your father's diary and when did he write the passage you read out?
So absolutely. So my father, hold on one second. I'm trying to see if I can do a view so I can see who asked the question. But anyways, my father wrote most of his diary retrospectively. So he wrote it in 1991 and 1992. And the way that my father survived really and all this trauma was by completely just putting it somewhere inside his head. And every so often it emerged, and you had the nightmares, or there's a moment when we went in to a train station in Prague, and there were tears and shaking. But most of the time it was just safely stored somewhere in the back of his head. And a series of quite cataclysmic events in my father's life happened in 1991 and 1992. In 1991, he lost his best friend, Zdeněk, and unbeknownst to me, because Zdeněk was never mentioned, my father and Zdeněk kept in touch throughout the war, and there was yearly correspondence and phone calls, despite the fact that one was in Teplice and the other one was in Caracas. And Zdeněk, and the other thing that I didn't know was in 1990, when I went with my father to Prague after the Velvet Revolution, my father saw Zdeněk. And Zdeněk told him that he was dying of cancer, and Zdeněk died in 1991. And I think that was a huge blow to my father. And then he lost, in the space of 3 days, he lost his own brother. So my uncle Lothar died. And when he was burying my uncle Lothar, my half brother, his older son, died of a heart attack. So it was in the space of 3 days, and that, as you may imagine, shook his entire world. And shortly thereafter, also he lost, shortly in the same sort of space of 12 months, he had lost Mila, his first wife, who he had by then divorced, but who obviously symbolized all sorts of things. And so he had these deaths, and I think that made him feel obviously much more vulnerable and really just shook him. And he started writing in 1991 and 1992. And of course, he didn't tie the two things together, certainly never to me. He did to show me. So the passage that I read, ironically, it's the only piece of writing that I had ever seen of my father's that related to the war. And he had shown it to me in 1992. And so he wrote most of it in 1991 and 92. There is one tiny little thing that he wrote later on, I think it's 95. And he wrote it in Spanish, which was, I now forget what I think it was a 6th language. So it wasn't the most beautifully written thing you've ever seen. It was very detailed. He liked details, my father. And he remembered lots of little details. And I thought that was brilliant because it helped me piece it together, and it helped, I hope, it helped the reader feel connected to him. So 91 and 92 was really when he wrote it. And there were about 24 typed pages of these writings. I didn't include them all because there were more characters, and the editors at Scribner were already quite worried that there were too many characters to begin with, so I couldn't introduce more. But yes, I don't know if that answers the question. Yes.
Yes, saying thank you. I've got quite a few questions. I'm going to, because we're always a little bit tight on time at the end. So
sorry, and I'll try to be briefer. Sorry.
No, it's fine. I would hate to cut you short, but I can see that as I'm asking you one question, I'm getting lots more coming through. So Elsie Prince has asked, to what extent was your mother aware of your father's past? How did she explain his nightmares you described so well? And how did she react or support you on your journey to find out about his past?
So my mother knew probably about 10% of what I have discovered. She knew the rough brushstrokes. She knew that he had gone to Berlin under a false identity. She had no idea of how long he had spent in Berlin. She had no idea about the details. She didn't, for example, know that he was a firefighter. She didn't remember the name Stenka. And it might sound sort of a little careless, perhaps, or a little sort of, but my mother is one of those people that is very focused, a bit like my father, in the present and in the future. She's not one of, she's 79 now, and she's not one of these people that sort of sits around being melancholic about her past. On the contrary, she doesn't do that at all. And she was, I think, at first slightly taken aback by the fact that, I mean, she kept on saying to me, I don't understand. You have this beautiful life, you have beautiful little children, wonderful husband, you live in London. Why do you want to go back into this darkness and explore all this and you know, find all these people that are, you know, that are no longer there and that had no bearing on who you are. So that was her initial reaction. And why do you want to, you know, there's a wonderful expression in Spanish, which is just, you know, why do you want to mess with things when they're not, you know, when they shouldn't be messed with. You know, who knows what you might uncover. And as I started uncovering things, she was incredibly supportive, and she is actually and has always been my best friend. And there were certain moments, like there was a moment where I received the picture of my cousin, my father's first cousin Otta, who was sent to Block 11 for swimming in the river. And I received it, and I was just so upset. And I received it on my phone, and I was in New York, and I was walking to her apartment, and I just walked in, and I just sobbed in her arms for hours. And she really was incredibly supportive and incredibly kind. She came to Resin with me, and I think it was very helpful for her as well. It was very difficult because I think a father-daughter relationship is always different than a husband-wife relationship, and what I expected of my father is completely different than what she expected of her life partner. And they were married for 17 years, but they were still life partners. So it was difficult, but she was very, very supportive. And I think it answered a lot of her questions as well. How did she explain the nightmares? She knew that my father had a difficult past. She, at some stage, went to a therapist who also explained to her that my father's past was so buried and so traumatic that it was probably, this is better left unexplored. And that sort of went quite well with her, idea of the world where you're engaged in the now rather than, why would she go and ask questions when it was clearly very upsetting and very difficult for my dad. So is that?
And next question is from somebody called Sandra. Thank you so much, Ariana. It's great to hear your thoughts about your beautiful book. Do you know if there were other secret visitors to Theresienstadt, or was Stenka's trips historically unique?
So no, it wasn't unique. It was uncommon though. So but there are some other documented visitors to Theresienstadt, and I forgive me, I don't remember the names, but there was definitely a young couple who were separated, and I think she was interned and he came and went. I mean, I said came and, he went in a few times, and the people did sneak parcels in, and there were my grandparents were very lucky to have this lifeline. But parcels did get snuck in to others. It was very unusual, and I think it's probably a sort of, a dozen people that did it or that are documented to have done it. So she wasn't the only one, but she was certainly one of a few that were brave enough to do it.
And a question, I've got two more questions to ask you. The first one is from Karen Kirsten. How has publishing the book affected relationships with your family and your father's friends?
So, I was very careful, and I think I have a couple of friends who've written memoirs, and they said everyone's going to stop talking to you, and I'm incredibly lucky that the opposite has happened. So no one stopped talking to me. I made sure that people read what I was going to publish beforehand. So obviously my cousin Madla read all the bits about her dad, and her sister also read the bits that were pertinent. There's a bit with engineer Langer, for example, who was a person who was crucial to my grandparents in Theresienstadt, and there was a suggestion in my grandparents' letters that Langer and my grandmother had an affair when they were in the camp, and it was very important to me as well that Langer's daughter, who lives in Australia, was happy with the way I portrayed these things, because obviously it's her father as well, so family relations are great. I have an enormous amount of new family. I have new cousins that write to me and say hello, and I also I've become quite good friends with Zdeněk Tuma's children. I've become incredibly close, and I exchange emails on at least a weekly basis with Stenka's daughter. So I really, I mean, it's been beautiful. I can't tell you anything negative other than the fact that I have a lot more friends and family than I have time for, really. So.
Right. Eva Clark's actually asked me a question. Are you nod if you're happy for me still to ask it, Eva. Oh, I'm just going to unmute Eva. Eva, I don't know if you can unmute yourself. Hello. I thought you'd like to ask a question yourself, Eva, because it's quite pertinent to your family history.
You may be much too young, but I just wondered if by any chance you had grown up or knew the daughters of Lisa and Erwin Ledenhardt. They were from Prague, and they ended up in Venezuela after the war. They were in Terezin. Lisa was with my mother in Auschwitz, Freiburg and Mauthausen, which is where I was born. I just wondered, like you do. My mother used to get not cross, but slightly irritated with me when I would meet somebody who was in Terezin, and I would immediately go to her and say, did you know? And she said, no, there were thousands and thousands of people there.
Well, I would say I think one should always ask questions, because actually it is remarkable, and you do never know what people, what connections, and if I hadn't asked a gazillion questions like that, I would have never gotten to where I am. The answer is actually I didn't grow up with any connection to the war. Everybody around me, if there was a connection to the war, they certainly didn't speak about it. I wasn't part of the Jewish community in Venezuela. There were a lot of Czechs that had emigrated that worked with my father. But I think also by the time I came along, which was in the 70s, they had been there for 20 years. So, you know, it's quite hard to bring
Generation.
up. And so I know a lot of people now that were in Venezuela that have come across and said, listen, I knew your father, and I knew he was Jewish, and you know, or I knew your grandparents in Prague before the war. They were interned. There was one family friend, there was one couple who survived. He survived Riga, and they were friends of my father, and she is actually still around, and I forget in what camp she was in. But it was one of the terrible ones in the Balkans. Sorry, I think it was in Latvia as well. Anyways, and she's still around, but there was only that couple. So sadly, no, I'm sorry.
Thank you for answering.
I have had one more question, but actually I think you've really answered it by your answer to Eva, which was, were there others with European roots in Venezuela, and were their past known? But you have sort of really answered that, unless you wanted to elaborate.
There was Venezuela, a bit like Argentina. There were a lot of survivors, and also there were not so much in Venezuela, but I've just recently found out that there were 18 Nazis who also escaped to Venezuela. And you know, I knew a lot of immigrants, including one that actually was on that list. So it was, you know, refugees come from all sorts of places, and they don't always come from the side that you want them to come from, I suppose. But anyways, it's Refugee Week, so it's wonderful that we're doing this talk.
Okay, I'm going to hand you back to Deborah now, because we've actually managed to get through the questions. So thank you, but I'll hand you back to Deborah for the final.
Excellent. Well, we have one lady who's waving. I think she's waving.
I think she's called Diana Hyman.
Diana, yes?
Yes.
Shall we take the last question from Diana? Let's, we've got 2 iPads. I don't know which one.
Diana, you need to unmute yourself. We're asking you to unmute.
Yeah, just one, because you've got 2 devices there, and it's going to
Yes.
give feedback. Okay, I think there's a problem. I think, okay, let's just carry on anyway, because it's 5 o'clock. So
she can always send me an email.
Yeah.
Diana, if you can hear me, I have an email. If you go to my website, Ariana Neumann, you can just send me an email, and I'm happy to reply to any questions.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. Well, so just want to ask you what you're working on now. What's next for Ariana, the writer, the author?
Well, I'm hoping that I will continue to be a detective and a writer for the rest of my life now. It's pretty late in my career to discover that what I was when I was 8 is really what I've always wanted to be. So now that I'm, you know, middle-aged, that's what I'm going to be. So I'm you know, solving mysteries and hopefully writing about them. Hopefully they will be pertinent enough that someone will want to read them. So I'm definitely working on more mysteries.
Great. And what are you reading at the moment? Any recommendations for us?
I'm reading this wonderful, wonderful Czech, and because it's Refugee Week, actually, he's a refugee from 1968. He went to Canada. He's called Josef Svirecki. And I don't know how I've missed him. He is brilliant. If you like Kundera, you would love him. He creates these wonderful, he brings out beauty in finds beauty in the most absurd situations. I am reading something called The Engineer of Souls. And then there's a wonderful American writer called Elizabeth Rosner. And she has two books that I've been reading. One is a novel, and it's called, sorry, I'm looking at my books and I know I have it, hold on. The Speed of Light, sorry, I knew it had something to do with light, and it's just beautiful. And the other one is called Survivor Cafe, and it's all about how we deal with trauma. So her father was a concentration camp survivor. He's still around, and she writes. She's a poet, and Liz Rosner is beautiful. So Joseph Sorecki and Liz Rosner are, and I'm reading The Rat Line as well. But that's it. I'm not reading, and I'm reading a lot of poetry because my attention span during COVID-19 is very variable. So if I can't, sometimes I find that I just can't concentrate for more than 5 minutes, and then I just go and I read any poet really, but Neruda always does the trick.
Sounds like you're reading a lot, so that's very good. So, excellent, lovely. Well, we're at 5 o'clock and there's still a little bit of sun outside, so I just want to thank you so much for spending the last hour with us, telling us some more about your wonderful book, which is available now when time stopped. And we hope to see you again soon. So thank you, everybody. Hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much for having me and for choosing a little bit of darkness instead of the light. Hopefully there was a little bit of light in there too.
Yes.
But going in for the sunshine.
Absolutely. Lovely.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Deborah, for hosting me. And soon. Thank you very much, Deborah and Susan.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone. Thank you.